the Guerrilla Economist, and we have the man of the hour. He needs no introduction. It is the one and only Harley Schlanger. Harley, what's going on, buddy? How are you?
I'm doing fine, V. How are you?
Good. I'm hanging in there, man. I can't complain. Lots of things going on, and it just seems as no matter how much liquidity, and I say that word euphemistically, that the Fed injects into the repo markets overnight to keep these banks solvent with their interbank lending so they can cover their minimum reserve requirements. It seems that there's no end in sight. It seems, Harley, that the handwriting is on the wall. It is mene mene tekel umfarsim. We've been laid to the weights and to the balances, and we've been found lacking. And it seems that negative interest rates are the only way out. It seems that quantitative easing will be the spigot that will be uncorked upon all of us. It is a brave new world indeed, and it doesn't get any better, Harley.
Well, 75 billion a night is going into these markets. It's being pumped into the Wall Street banks so they can roll things over for a day. And when you're on that kind of turnaround, they did it the first day and they said, well, we think this will solve the problem. They came back the next morning and they needed another 200 billion. I think it's now somewhere close to 400 billion they've pumped in. And they're now saying they may have to continue this for 3 more weeks. Now, what's going to happen in 3 weeks? What's going to change things? The problem is that the liquidity, no one knows exactly where it's going. And it ends up, is it going to be quantitative easing 6 or whatever? I don't know what the number would be this time.
It'll be to infinity and beyond.
Well, there's no end to it because they're not addressing the problem. The problem is not liquidity. The problem is unsustainable debt.
Yeah.
And carrying banks that are carrying on their books financial instruments of either no value or indeterminate value. And they insist that they have to keep rolling these over. And in fact, they have to, unless you're going to have the whole system blow out. Yeah. Now, there are some people who say, well, this is their intention to blow out the whole system. And I don't fully buy that. I think there are people who are plotting, how can we make sure we can control things after the blowout? But I think they would prefer to have an orderly flow of funds going into their pockets.
Yes.
And having to do things this way introduces an element of chaos, which makes things uncontrollable. And this thing could go one of 2 or 3 different directions. Either you could have a decision made by President Trump that this is not the way to go, and he sits down with Xi Jinping and works out some kind of yuan dollar fixed exchange peg that would then be the basis for a new Bretton Woods. Or you could have a chaotic blowout, in which case you'd literally be sentencing hundreds of millions, if not billions of people to death. Because what a blowout would mean is that if you can't get liquidity into these markets, you're going to have a complete shutdown of commerce. Food's not going to move. Gasoline and oil is not going to move. Utility companies are going to go under. Look, just today, this company, Thomas Cook, went bankrupt.
Oh, yeah. Major European airliner, been around for 130 years, the company.
And it left 600,000 people stranded.
Yep.
So these are not minor problems. But is the solution more liquidity? I mean, that's like saying that the solution to someone who's going through heroin withdrawal is to give them unlimited amounts of heroin. It's not going to help them. And whatever eases the pain for the moment is going to be a bigger pain the next moment. Yeah. So we've got to move toward the solution that LaRouche proposed after the 2008 crash, which really is that we have to let the speculators go and eat their own losses. But to do that, you have to have banking reform. And by reform, I mean radical reform. Glass-Steagall, which would essentially say there will be no bailout, there will be no stealing of depositors' money or no taxpayers' bailout, no government bailout. Eat your debt. The commercial banks we would save largely because they have some real assets there that don't belong to them, that belong to their savers and belong to their checking account holders and their business accounts. Those have to be saved. But then you need a new stream of liquidity. You do need low interest credit. but it has to go somewhere other than into bubbles. And this is going to require something that will probably make the 1933 policy small in comparison, because it's now global and it's been inflated to unbelievable levels.
You know, I was reading a headline, and I don't remember the exact number, Harley. It was hundreds of billions, in fact, maybe even trillions of dollars worth of assets, or quote unquote equities, have no underlying asset to support them. And I think it was in the trillions, and I forgot exactly how many trillions it was.
What you just did, V, is give the definition of derivatives.
Exactly.
It's things that are marked up at a certain value with nothing underlying. Their value is derived from something else. Often they're like side bets. And then you have side bets where people sell swaps to insure them. So you're insuring something that has no underlying value. And the companies selling these swaps have no money.
Yep.
The agencies that are supposed to protect them, these so-called counterparty trades, I'm forgetting the name of them right now. They're based in London. These three companies that guarantee that these are legitimate deals. They have no money. So how do you back up something that's inherently worthless when you're creating dollars that are going to become increasingly worthless? And that's the problem they face.
Yeah.
And I think the president is aware that this is a giant scam. He so far has pitched his tent in the camp with the bubble economy and the stock market. He can get out of that, but he's going to have to get out of it quickly, because the 2020 election is out of his control as long as he is cheerleading a stock market bubble.
Yeah.
He's got to take it over and basically say, we're not going to protect these worthless assets.
Yeah. It has to get done. I mean, it is terrifying. And it should be incredibly terrifying, Harley, for every American out there, knowing that the only thing that is providing the minimum level of solvency, and I use that word solvency again euphemistically because they're all insolvent, but to add any sort of modicum of solvency is to go ahead and partake in the FMOC, which is just basically the buying and selling of U.S. debt back and forth to the same number of parties. And that's terrifying in and of itself. What happens when the dollar loses value? What happens when the ongoing de-dollarization that you and I have been talking about for years now, Harley, coming to fruition at an alarming rate, faster than ever before? You know, what happens when the U.S. is the last man holding the straw? What happens when the U.S. is on the outside looking in? Most people are not even thinking of these angles, Harley.
Well, there's actually some good news in what you just laid out, which is that much of the world is realizing that they're going to have to get out of this system.
Yep.
And so you have, besides the alternatives to SWIFT for the exchanges, you also have large purchases of gold going on by Russia, by China. I'm told even India and Japan are buying a lot of gold. And more importantly, they're creating credit also at low interest, but it's going into something physical. It's going into production. And all the people who are running around talking about the Chinese debt is unsustainable, I mean, I find it humorous when
Bannon right there and Kyle Bass, they've been running around.
I was just going to say, well, here's Kyle Bass, who's making a fortune trading on a bigger debt bubble, talking about China's debt bubble. Now, China does have debt, but that debt is going into physical production. And what someone like Kyle Bass either doesn't understand or does understand but doesn't want you to understand is that the American system, what Alexander Hamilton set up, was a credit system. There's nothing wrong with government creating credit. The question is, where does it go? If you have a government that turns over the credit generating capabilities to private bankers who are out for private profits, then don't be surprised if you have new bubbles and if you end up being stuck with the losses. But if you have a government that's supporting the credit system that provides credit for entrepreneurs, for medium and small enterprises, for research and development, then you may miss on a few loans, But for the most part, what the American system showed is that we have creative entrepreneurs who will produce things of value. And the
Correct.
question is, how do you add more value to the system? And you don't add value by buying and selling carbon credits. That's
Yeah.
one of the most transparent frauds that's ever been invented. And then they get these fake scientists talking about, well, we need to do this because we're consuming too much. They're really trying to convince Americans that the cause of global warming, which in itself is questionable whether there's really that much warming, but they're trying to convince Americans that eating meat, heating your house in the winter, cooling it in the summer, taking hot showers, that's what's causing the planet to overheat. And therefore, you've got to cut your standard of living.
Right.
Now, you don't see Al Gore cutting his standard of living or George Soros cutting his standard of living. In fact, they're figuring out how to make profits by getting you to accept austerity.
Mm-hmm.
That's the game that's going on now.
Yeah, the other thing also is that most people don't realize this. The whole Green New Deal is massive deindustrialization, and a lot of people are correct when they say, "Yeah, it's deindustrialization. Yeah, it's going to be terrible," but they don't understand. When you deindustrialize a nation, you're destroying its wealth. And what people make the mental disconnect, Harley, is this: wealth is never destroyed; it's only transferred. So while we're being deindustrialized, Wall Street is going to pilfer us. They're going to literally suck the lifeblood from out of us as a nation. And then what are we left with in terms of industry? More paper, more.
The other part of that is that when you deindustrialize, you lower wages.
Correct.
And people have less disposable income, they buy less. So how do you sustain a consumer economy? The only way you do it is cheap or no interest credit. But all that does is create a new debt bubble. And we see it with the amount of credit card debt. People talk about how much government debt there is. And there's, it's close to 23 trillion now, and it's growing at an alarming annual rate.
Correct.
But there's 13 trillion in corporate debt, most of which that's being issued now is at junk bond ratings. Then you have credit card debt, where the default levels are starting to grow and the delinquency rates are increasing. You have the student loan debt, where people can't afford it. And I don't know whether Bernie Sanders actually has a plan to do something about it, but I think sooner or later there's going to be a giant rebellion of people who are 40 years old, living at their mother's house and don't have a pot to piss in. What are they going to do? And we're going to see an explosion of rage in the United States that will be directed at bankers. I was just reading what was going on, a report on what was going on in the 1880s when you had the farm bankruptcies, the auctions, and where judges would come with bankers to preside over them, and they were lucky if they made it out of there without being hanged. Mm-hmm. So, we're going to see this kind of explosion take place because you cannot expropriate people indefinitely without a reaction. And some of these expropriations mean death, with elderly, with people with illnesses and handicap. Right. They die from these policies. You don't think George Soros knows that, or Tom Steyer knows that? I know Greta Thunberg doesn't know it because I don't think she knows much of anything except the script they give her. But the average American who's tightening their belt and figuring, well, Trump will do something, you'd better put the pressure on him to do something, because at this point, we're seeing a drift into an extremely dangerous sea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are seeing a massive drift, and you have this economic issue with the Fed that's literally operating as a fifth column at this point. We have the foreign policy that has gone askew, where they're literally trying to hook us into war with Iran, which will not work at all. It's very interesting how these two parameters, the economic side and the warfare side, are still the deep state and its bankers and its British control mechanisms are still trying to pull us into this mess, Harley.
And it's not just about defense spending, which a lot of people think. It's about how you manipulate a population. You create an enemy image so that instead of being mad at the Federal Reserve and the private bankers, people get mad at the Iranians or at the Venezuelans or at the Chinese communists or who's the latest enemy image, Islamic terrorists. And what we saw when Trump came in was a strategy for reversing this. He
Yeah.
intended to work with Putin and with Xi Jinping. With Putin, you're addressing two things. One is the overall situation in Europe, which is a disaster, and the other thing is the terrorism in the Middle East. And Putin actually did coordinate to some extent with the U.S. military to clean out a significant portion of the terror operations in Iraq and Syria. And if the truth comes out on this, it'll be very clear that these terror operations were a product of the intelligence community. So they created the causes for war and then used that to plunge us into war. And Trump said, we're not going to spend trillions. We're not going to lose young Americans anymore. We're going to get out of these wars. And what do? They say, well, he's saying that because Putin caught him peeing on a bed with a prostitute in Moscow. Now, that story's gone. What do we have now? The so-called Ukraine story. Well, let's get the truth out about Ukraine.
Yeah.
The Obama team carried out a coup in Ukraine
Correct.
against the pro-Russian government, but also pro-Europe. But they used Nazi militia to carry out the coup. It was a
Svoboda.
legal coup funded by the State Department, the National Endowment for Democracy. And the crime for Biden, I don't know what Hunter Biden was doing, and it'd be interesting to find out. But the real crime, and this is what the Republicans or the Trump supporters should talk about, the real crime is the Obama administration carried out a coup in Ukraine to expand NATO eastward and to break the possibility of an alliance with Russia. That's the scandal, not Trump talking to the Ukrainian president about let's solve some of these problems. The other thing I'm sure will come out if we get the transcripts of the talk that Trump had with Zelensky, the new president, is they're talking about how to resolve Crimea.
Yeah.
And you had the prisoner swap between Russia and Ukraine, which is a positive step. You had Macron meet with Putin, and then Macron offer, and you can't really trust that guy, but he did offer to restart up the Normandy process to de-escalate the fighting that's going on in eastern Ukraine. You had the firing of Bolton, who was part of the network that wanted the Ukraine coup.
Yeah.
Partly because anytime there's a regime change, Bolton's out there cheerleading for it. So you want to get the Ukraine story out? Stop listening to the damn mainstream media with their spin on it. The Ukraine story is that the coup in Ukraine was designed to prevent a U.S.-Russian rapprochement. Obama wanted to continue the confrontation, the provocations against Russia, move NATO eastward. And Trump came in and said, we're going to stop this. And so he's attacked as an agent of Putin.
Correct.
I think I welcome this Ukraine story coming out because I think what it's going to do is show the blood on the hands of people like Susan Rice and Samantha Power, Victoria Nuland.
Yep. And Hillary Clinton.
The whole U.S. crowd.
Yeah. I call it the four harpies. The four harpies that were in charge of foreign policies. The harpies of foreign policy, Harley. And not only that, I mean, a lot of people talk about the whole Ukraine natural gas shenanigans that went on with Hunter Biden. But also, these operations go even further back. I mean, look at what happened with the whole LNG operations that ran in Romania, that ran in Latvia, in Lithuania. All these places that it seems good old Hunter boys, little fingerprints. And that guy is a basket case and a hot mess on a personal level, Harley. All sorts of issues going on with that kid. But my God, to say the least, it's unbelievable.
Well, then there's the other part of Ukraine, which is how it figured into Russiagate. Now, I don't know how many people are aware of this, but Christopher Steele, before he was hired by Fusion GPS, who was paid by the Clinton campaign to write his dossier against Trump, where do you think he was? He was in Kiev. He wrote
Right.
100 memos leading up to the period of the February 2014 coup, where he was basically giving instructions to the State Department to a guy named Jonathan Weiner, who uh, answered to Victoria Nuland and before that to Hillary Clinton and then later to John Kerry. But Weiner was the one who brought Christopher Steele in when Steele wrote his dossier against Trump. So this is a deep network inside the State Department that ran the coup. These are, by the way, the same people trying to run a coup in Hong Kong right now to stop the Belt and Road Initiative. But if you look at the role of Christopher Steele, you see it's totally coherent because what does Steele represent? He represents the city of London, the
Yes.
interests of the British Empire. You know, I find it so humorous that people in Hong Kong are demonstrating with British flags and calling for return to the British mandate. They weren't free under the British. The
No, they
British
weren't.
came in and set up Hong Kong as a drug money laundering
Correct.
operation as part of the Opium War in the 19th century.
Correct.
Learn some damn history, people. Get this straight. I mean, Marco Rubio is someone who, if he weren't so dangerous, should be put back in the third grade.
And most people don't realize it was a malaria infested rock with a couple of fishing huts, man. That's what Hong Kong was before the Brits came in and decided, hey, you know what, this is a great launch off point for the opium trade, and
Exactly.
and that's how it really developed: opium and money laundering.
And don't forget, when the Chinese rebelled against it, when the Chinese rebelled against the British, what happened? There were two opium wars where the British sent in their fleet and leveled Shanghai the second time in 1859.
Right.
And it was in 1861 that they set up the Bank of Hong Kong in Shanghai, which to this day is still at the center of drug and gun money laundering.
Absolutely correct. HSBC is neck deep in cartel money, neck deep.
So this idea that this is about freedom, I thought it was kind of interesting that Joshua Wong was celebrated at the same event where Greta Thunberg showed up. And you know, here you have Obama. You talk about your ironies. Obama, you know, giving a fist bump to Greta Thunberg, saying we're a team. Uh, I remember when Obama went to Kenya about 5 years ago, and the students there were really excited to see him, and they were hoping that they could talk to him about how to develop their country. And what did Obama tell them? Forget it. For you to have an American style of living in Kenya with central air conditioning, with automobiles and things of that sort, will boil the planet over. And he said to them, you have to go the sustainable way. Well, he was not very welcome after that in Kenya. And because the Africans are talking about developing nuclear power, about jumping to the next phase of industrialization, not going back to the pre-Stone Age with a wooden rake and a hoe. So I thought it was totally appropriate for the British agent Obama to be welcoming Greta Thunberg and her completely unscientific rantings against modern economy.
Yeah.
Look, there are real things that have to be changed about the economic policies in the Western world. But one of them is not to go backwards in the energy flux density production that's needed to sustain 7+ billion people on the planet.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly correct. Harley, lots of things, my friend. Lots of things. It's going to be interesting to see how in the next coming days, as we're getting closer and closer to the great unraveling towards the end of the year, how things will play out. Indeed, I mean, you have the banking issues. We have maybe the trade deal that's blowing in the wind. So many things, my friend. So many things. How do you see the remainder of this year playing out, Harley?
Well, you know, it's not accidental that September and October are usually points where you have stock market crashes.
Yeah, we're
And
heading for a Rocktober.
yeah, and you know, the thing that people have to realize about this is that if you're in the stock market, you're basically in a floating casino game that you don't control. There is a house in the stock market, and it's not you. And The solution is not to try and find some place to stash your money. I mean, some people put dollars in a mattress. Other people look at Bitcoin. They look at all sorts of things. We need something different. We need a change in policy. And people who are legitimately fearful about the period ahead, especially older people who know they don't have enough money, and if Social Security goes, they're going to have nothing. The solution is to change the policy. And we have a president who doesn't like the Federal Reserve System, who doesn't like the relations that we have with the nations of Europe, which are all completely dominated by the British Empire, even with Brexit. I think I said this on this program before, but the City of London worked out an arrangement with the clearinghouses for derivatives so that the three major clearinghouses in the world that right now are controlling something like 61 trillion in interest rate derivatives and swaps, they're going to be allowed to continue to function in the European Union even after Brexit. They were given an exemption. So the EU knows where the problem is and what they have to do to sustain the bubble. That bubble is unsustainable. Those clearinghouses don't have enough cash to back up the trades that they're certifying. So I think the period immediately ahead through the end of this year is going to be extremely rocky. I don't know whether they can continue to bluff and use the plunge protection team or the negative rates to make it through the end of the year. But what you really have to look at is the third curve. While you have financial aggregates skyrocketing and monetary aggregates until recently were going on a downward turn, now they're back up again with this money pumping. The third curve is the production curve, and it's crashing. And whatever you do with money and monetary aggregates and financial aggregates, if you don't have production, eventually people die. And that's where we have to put our attention, focus our attention right now.
It truly is terrifying, to say the least. And I think the only game left to play for the banksters is negative interest rates and QE to infinity.
And you know what? That hasn't worked too well. The QE and negative interest rates aren't going to work either.
It's the last hurrah, Harley.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the last hurrah. I think they're gonna this round of negative QE. This round of negative interest rates and QE. I think it's going to blow the biggest bubble in global history. I think we're going to surpass Dow 29,000.
In Europe, they couldn't get anybody to take the money they were putting out. Did you see that? The offering last week, no one would buy anything.
Yeah. Yep. The bid and offers. It was just unreal.
Unreal. There's a reason for that, because some of the investors are smart enough to know a scam when they see it.
Yeah.
And they don't want to be the last one holding the worthless instruments.
Yep. Correct. There's not many participants in this game of monetary musical chairs, Harley. Not many left.
There aren't many chairs either.
No, I think we're down to one chair. We're down to one chair, and that chair is labeled NERP/QE. That's it. That's the only thing left for them to have.
And there are about 50 people circling it.
Yep. It's going to be
interesting. Have hearing aids and can't hear the music.
No, exactly. And the craziest thing is, we're going to see Dow 29,000, but we're going to see it as a monolith casting a shadow on an economy that's been completely decimated, a physical economy that's going to be suffering, all the while the phony baloney, phantom money, tilt-a-whirl casino that we call Wall Street is going to be new records, Harley. It's the last thing they have left. It's the last of the wealth extraction scheme.
Yep. That's right.
Anyway.
So we need these radical reforms in banking. We need Glass-Steagall. We need a national credit policy. And we need a debt write-down or write-off.
Yep. Exactly. It's all about the name. The what people should be looking forward to is what this restructuring is going to look like. Because it's not a question about if it will pop, because it's going to. It's when it will pop. What is the reordering going to look like, number one? And number two, who is going to be in charge of that narrative?
Yeah.
Because perception is reality. Anyway,
Well,
Harley, thank you so much, man. Sorry,
we have to be on top of this, and
absolutely.
People can get my weekly articles by just sending me an email, and I'll link you up with my blog page. It's harleysch@gmail.com. And I did get a lot of emails last week. People are obviously responding, and they're writing, well, what else can we do?
Yeah. Exactly correct. What else can we do? There's many things ahead, Harley. Many things ahead.
That's right.
Folks, thank you so much for listening in. This is once again V, and we are with Harley Schlanger. Again, you can follow his work over at theschillerinstitute.org, theschillerinstitute.org, and also at larouchepack.com, larouchepack.com. With that being said, thank you all for listening. We are over and we're out.